Hello and welcome to Grody UnPrOfeSSiOnAL. My name is Justin McMenamy, and my mission is to share both profitable and painful leadership lessons I have acquired over a 20-year career as a misfit in corporate America. In this episode, I am joined by Jeff Snowden as we discuss leadership lessons harvested from the career of Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy. Jeff, it is so good to have you join me today for Grody UnPrOfeSSiOnAL. Before we get started, I have to tell you a story. When I tell someone that Jeff Snowden is joining me on Grody UnPrOfeSSiOnAL, most people in society think of another famous Snowden that I may be interviewing. And I have to remind them that that person's name is actually Ed Snowden, not Jeff Snowden. Just for clarity right here at the beginning, can you confirm that you are not a Russian operative that shared state secrets in 2013?
Listen here, comrade. Yeah, it's funny. I traced looked at our genealogy, and Uncle Eddie is from the Snowdens came into the country two different ways. They came in through South Carolina, or they came in through up in the New England area. He's from the New England Snowdens. I'm from the South Carolina Snowdens. Funny joke, though, is that my family, I'm from a military family and a governmental family. And so whenever you have to have a background check and a little bit of Snowden comes up in your background check, that tends to complicate things a little bit.
Do you remember the day that name broke and you realized that you were now going to be affiliated with some national news?
I think it's the other way around. I think that he was like, man, now it's like I'm publicly known and I'm going to be affiliated with Jeff Snowden, publisher of very low quality marketing books and number 221 in the Thrill in the Hills triathlon.
Jeff, like I said, it's so great to have you here today. If you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself, let the listeners know a little bit about yourself.
I have been very, very blessed to live a very rich experience and opportunity and blessing life. I've really gotten to do almost everything I wanted to do as a kid. I remember coming out of college at the University of Georgia, and I was like, everybody loves the advertising and marketing guy. He's got the endless expense account. Oh, we're going to make movies, and we're going to be on the radio, and everybody loves that. And so, I had done some of that while I was in college already, and I was like, this is for me. And I've gotten to do so many cool things that people probably don't really think like this is what I aspire to do. But, you've been in the ag business that, for a guy who's never been involved with ag, to be in your first fall harvest and to be walking through that field at sunset and listening to those leaves blowing around and looking up at the pink sky and all that. And it's just so ethereal. And it's like, most people who don't grow up around that understand how awesome that is.
Did you grow up in the ag industry?
No, not at all. I grew up in metro Atlanta where we tipped over porta potties and egged the stop signs. We were the suburban chaos. And so this was just totally fresh to me and my business partner. Before we got in the ag side of things, we did restaurants and banks and stuff like that. I had no idea, how this stuff worked.
That's awesome. Now, Jeff, in addition to your day job of leading a marketing organization, you've also written several books as a side hobby. Is that right?
I have. And it's, how it started is I was writing newsletters out to my friends. I'd write these just email posts. I would just take these like really obscure positions and just defend them intently and write them up into these elaborate stories. And my friends would just double over in laughter. Like I had this theory that modern country is a psyop from the CIA because they were worried about like Johnny Cash and, Merle Haggard and all these guys that were like fight the system and kind of rebellious. And they're like, look, we have got to stop this. We need people to sing about, just good down home living, honest living, grow some corn in the front yard. We need to bring in agents Tim McGraw and Agent Garth Brooks, and they're going to sing about good, wholesome things, and we're going to put all these outlaws in the background. I'd written this long discussion trying to prove what we called Operation Banjo String by the government, and my friends thought it was hysterical. And so versions of this started to evolve into a book. that I called Gin, Incense, and Deacon Blues, which was kind of dispatches from the industry. Advertising is such a goofy business, and a lot of it is done just wrong. This
Right.
book came from that. And once you figure out how to write one book, there's no stopping you, because it's not as hard as they make it
Sure.
out to do. And so you're like, hey, I have a strong opinion about these things. Genesis and Dinka Blues was really about the advertising industry. And then I wrote a book called The Promise and the Trust. And The Promise and the Trust was really about marketing. And it distilled marketing down to really, really simple understanding of our goal is just two things. We need to make a compelling promise to the people we're selling to. And then we need to do the things that they can trust it. That's it. And, there's so many other things that go on in marketing that are useless. But my argument, at least in that book, would be these are the essentials you need to think about. How good is your promise? Do they trust that you'll make good on that promise? So that book, it's
Right.
not exactly
Right.
a page turner for people who aren't in marketing, but it does spell out a pretty good process.
So in the next episode that I have you in, we'll discuss the role of Chris Gaines and Beyonce in the modern CIA operation of country music.
Don't rule it out.
Today, what I wanted to discuss is a project that you're working on. You have written a book, or are working presently on a book, titled The Cut of His Jib. The book is one part biography and one part leadership survey of a gentleman by the name of Admiral Hyman Rickover. Now, most people that have watched the History Channel or have watched popular movies, they know who Patton is. They know who MacArthur is. You got to work down the list of military generals and admirals to get to Hyman Rickover. Share a little bit about what led you to the story of Hyman Rickover, and what are some of the aspects that you found interesting, kind of as an overview of his life, his career, and his passions.
Well, it's a really crazy story. So in late 2019 or so, I had an opportunity to go tour the U.S. Naval Academy. Two of my uncles are graduates there, and my uncle Tommy Fleming offered to fly over from California and take me and my wife and my three sons on the tour of the Naval Academy. We got to walking around and enjoying it. It's a very beautiful place, but it is all things Navy. When you're there, it is all things Navy. It is Navy lore. They got John Paul Jones's body down in the basement of the chapel, and it's rumored he's been pickled in brandy so they could ship him across the ocean. And we come home, and in early 2020, of course, the pandemic hits. I'm trying to find something to occupy my son's time. I asked him, I said, let's have a project. And they said, we want to build a working submarine. I was like, what? Well, in the process of doing this, I found myself reading a good bit on naval architecture. Like, how are these things built? Because I'm not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm learning about these things. And it got me reading about Hyman Rickover. My background, not in engineering, but my formal education and all that is in psychology, and primarily psychologies of groups or organizations. I'm just interested in how groups of people work together, how they make certain choices. And in my marketing practice, that's what I'm supposed to specialize in is, what persuades these people to do these things? Why do they do them? And what sequence do they do them in? I come across Rickover, and you get all the craziest stuff first. You get stories of Rickover locking people in closets and stuff like that. That's how I kind of stumbled onto this subject.
What are some of the aspects of his biography that stood out to you that really locked you in from reading about him to deciding to write on him?
Yeah, that's one of the funny things about the title, too. It's the cut of his jib. That's supposed to be the look he gives off. When it came to Rickover's presence of a naval officer, I don't think you could find a worse person. He was like 105 pounds, wringing wet. He was short. His family escaped from Poland as the communists were moving into Poland. And so his family was able to escape when he was a little kid, and he immigrated to the United States. And he gets a job after high school. He's delivering telegrams for Western Union, and a congressman got to meet him and offered to submit his name for appointment to the Naval Academy. He became quite a phenomenal young officer, the youngest engineering officer on a destroyer. It was not an unpopular thing to do, to transfer into an emerging service to speed up your
Okay.
trajectory towards command, because these new services that are coming out, they don't have the old dogs in them. They don't have the lineup of people who want to be in them.
Okay.
Transferred into the subservice because it was decently new. and you could get qualified for command, and he did.
This would have probably been the 1920s.
Yeah, probably a little later than that, but just a little bit later than that.
Okay.
So he gets qualified for command in submarines. He wasn't there very long because he had put in his papers to transfer to an engineering duty officer. For the non-naval people, you have unrestricted line officers. These are battle fighters, okay? People that go out and make war. But
Okay.
you have specialty people in these places that they don't go off and make war. They have special positions. An engineering duty officer,
Yep.
you're basically taking yourself off the first string offense and putting yourself on the kicking team. Now, kickers win football games, so it's not necessarily a huge step back if you do it with excellence. Rickover understood himself, and he knew what he wanted to do, and so he had gone back to become an engineering duty officer. This is just post World War II. He mothballed ships. All these ships coming in from World War II that we're not going to use anymore, he's climbing through these things. He's down in the bilge. He's looked where they've been hit by gunfire, where they, maybe a bomb fell from an airplane. And he is climbing through the bowels of ships like no one has ever done in the history of the Navy. There's this story of this guy, he calls and he says, we were working on this turbine and a bolt came loose and it fell. And Rickover was like, which ship? Which turbine system? Okay, you're going to go down 3 feet to the right. There's an inspection door. Open it. Reach inside, and that bolt is going to be on a flat piece of metal just to your right. Guy opens it up. It was dead on. It was right there. Rickover knew so much about the operations of these ships, but how did he do it? Was he playing golf at War College or maybe, attending a ceremony in his whites? No, he was climbing through the innards of the ship and did it for years.
Yeah.
I love that story about him because it's it shows the commitment to do the dirty stuff, the nasty stuff. At the conclusion of World War II, there was lots of discussion about what are we going to do with nuclear energy? How does this stuff work? And the best research was going on at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So Rickover grabs 4 or 5 guys and he goes down to Oak Ridge, Tennessee to study nuclear reactors and nuclear propulsion. He was dutiful and he pushed to attend every class, every seminar. And these are the world-class nuclear physicists all descended down on Oak Ridge, Tennessee, teaching, learning, experimenting. So Rickover is determined that he knows the best use for nuclear propulsion. You got to remember is at the conclusion of World War II, the aviators came back with ribbons and rank and everything. And the idea is that the aircraft carrier was the new standard. It's the new battleship. It's the future warfare.
Yeah.
Rickover's not convinced. He thinks that it needs to go in a submarine. And so he sneaks that idea all the way up to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's now the head of, he's the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations. And Nimitz agrees. And all of the aviators go nuts. They are furious. He went over like 4 other positions to go straight to the head boss and say this needs to be in submarines. And of course, Nimitz was an old submariner himself. And he was like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. They were so mad. So when he comes back to his office in Washington, they don't give him a regular office. They get a women's restroom and convert it into his office. And put him in there just to embarrass him. He's got no windows or anything. Just put him in there to embarrass him. To this day, he holds the record for the longest serving person in the United States military.
Yeah, 63 years is how long he was an active member of the U.S. military.
He was super old.
Yeah, so the other part that I really enjoyed about the book is that you take leadership principles from the stories and lift them off the page. And I wanted to talk through some of them just to get not just the Rickover stories that undergird these observations, but also any experiences you've had professionally of how these leadership styles differentiate the okay or the moderate leader into the better or the exceptional leader. One of them that you talk about is that a leader should know their talents. And by knowing their talents, not just focus on their talents, but they should take that knowledge and select teammates appropriately. Select teammates that complement their skills and their strengths. Talk to me a little bit about how you saw that in your research of Rickover.
Back up to when he made the decision to become an engineering duty officer. He knew in his heart that that was the best place to serve his country. Sometimes if you go on LinkedIn, you run into old naval officers, they list command at sea as their big deal. Rickover had command at sea for like 3 months. He knew where he offered the country the most, and he did the brave thing to go over to it.
So really it was as much about him placing himself in the organization that most played to his strengths, even if inside of that organization it was viewed as a lesser role. It was viewed that he took himself off the fast track.
Yeah.
Or he
It's
took
amazing.
himself off the path to praise and to honor and to glory and to success and these things, and said, I see my own skill set and I see the organization needs that. It's not the most prestigious place to end up, but it's the place that I'm most needed.
We all know people that, like any organization, has this kind of fast track to go on, and they look at it and they're like, no, that's not for
Yeah.
me. I have different goals. I know who I am. I
Mhm.
know what I'm tolerant of and what I aspire to, and I will pursue that. That's brave. Most
Yeah.
people are like, hey, you give me the quickest route to the company car, and that's where I'm headed. Once in a
Yeah.
while, you run into a person who's like, no, I have different goals. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. No, that's right. Another aspect in the book is when he took that role, he also chose people around him that complemented his skill sets.
One of the guys I interviewed for the book who worked for Rickover told me that he thought that Rickover just had a hard time talking to people of average intelligence. He could not communicate with someone that was not on the same level as him, or at least close to it. So Rickover would go and get these people that were the good grease. My favorite example of this is Andy Anderson. Rickover was looking for who were going to be his commanding officers of his subs as they came out. Just prior to this was when the Russians had launched Sputnik into the air, and that had really
Mm.
frustrated President Eisenhower, and he wanted a counterpunch of some sort. Now, nuclear weapons, if you were to do a ground based launch, they would have to go over the poles, and there would be
Yeah.
tremendous warning as they go over the poles. Submarines trying to make their way through other areas would be challenged by terrain or by detection. Anderson felt like he could take the Nautilus under the polar ice caps and pop up on Russia's back
Mm.
door. And Ike was just giddy over this idea because Sputnik had embarrassed the country. He wanted to show the Russians that a submarine could depart our west coast, pop up out from under the ice caps, deliver a payload, and then go back under and basically be unpursuable. When Anderson pops up on the other side of the poles, they don't even wait for him to come back. They like fly him to Finland, and then they fly him back for like a ticker tape parade and all this stuff. You want to talk about the cut of his jib? He just cuts the look of a naval officer. Super positive. Thanks everybody. He's got the look and all of that, and he is the man who stuck it to the Russians by popping out from under the ice. But before he leaves Washington, he has his motorcade stop and he goes to see the old man and shake his hand and thank him. And it meant a lot to Rickover because, Rickover would hire these people, some of which he could not contain them. And they would go on to do stuff.
Right.
But they would come back and they would say, thank you. Thank you for believing in me and stuff like that. And, Rickover, maybe in the back of his mind, he kind of wished he was there at the controls going under the ice. I think he knew he
Sure.
couldn't do that. So he picked the next best people who could. And he did that in every role around him.
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect as we think about leadership and in particular choosing the team around you. A lot of it starts with a leader knowing themselves and knowing what their strengths are, but invariably that requires you to define areas that you're not as good in or you're not as experienced in. And it takes a level of humility, one, to admit that you have areas that you're not good at. Then two, to admit that those areas are worth somebody being good at, right? You'll oftentimes hear a leader that says, oh, I'm not good at this or this, but our organization doesn't need that. So I'm just going to hire a photocopy of myself.
Or several.
So it takes a humility, not just of yourself, but it takes a humility of knowing that what you're not good at is worth doing or is worth having. and then bringing in people that are very talented, and oftentimes you use the word they're hard to control. Now, control could be either because they're wild and they're not following orders, or it could be because their talents are bringing attention to themselves. Their talents are bringing accolades to themselves. The spotlight is moving from the leader to other people on the team. And that takes even yet a greater degree of humility by a leader, not just to know your weakness, not just to hire someone that fills that weakness, but then to let them succeed, let them show off their ability, show off their talent to the end that they get accolades.
Rickover employed people that were ambitious enough for their individual jobs. He said his belief was to get great people and grow them and give them money and where it's appropriate rank, but don't promote them to their point of incompetence or don't transfer them all over the place.
Sure.
And that's an issue that I see a good bit in my practice, is that it's like, this fella or this lady over here, oh, they were really good at like tracking this inventory or doing this process over here completely unrelated to marketing. Voila, now you're in charge of marketing. I feel
Sure.
like the college professor teaching marketing 101 every 18 months, which, don't get me wrong, I love doing that. But, my joke when I've
Right.
been in the side of big organizations is, man, I can't wait till they come by and tell me that it's my turn to be the corporate lawyer. And people are like, what are you talking about? I was like, yeah,
Sure.
I mean, because I got to rotate around and get a feel for the company. So at some point, I'm going to get to be general counsel. I'm like, well, no, that's a specialized job. Oh, is it? Is it? Because some of these other things are specialized jobs too, but for whatever reason, we think we can just rotate everybody through them as if
Sure.
excellence and knowledge in these sectors don't matter. Rickover really held on to his specialist and took care of them, really to the point where they almost had to go, because civil service jobs, if you're buying a yacht with a civil service job, we might need to see where else you're getting your money from.
Right.
Possibly agent pick up and drop off. A lot of these folks left to go to their consulting jobs in order to make a little more wealth. But yeah, he was particularly good about building a team, having people with great strengths that supplemented or complemented his own. A lot of people can do this. It does
Right.
take swallowing your pride, though. You got to swallow your pride, and you got to spot talent that's good for the right reasons.
One other aspect that you pulled out of his biography is that there's no experience like experience. In the introduction, you mentioned that he spent a fair number of years inventorying every bolt, every stairwell, every electrical wire inside of some of these ships as they were being decommissioned. He spoke from and led from a very rich and thorough experience of the disciplines that he was leading. How did that influence his leadership as he stepped into the roles?
Rickover did not even start with anything nuclear till he was over 50. What was he doing before? He's climbing in the bows of ships. Oak Ridge was no picnic. And this is what this guy's doing in what would be often the top of somebody's naval career. I have got a guy that I work with off and on now who is a pretty high up sales leader, and he started on the manufacturing floor building the product as an hourly employee. And he worked
Mm-hmm.
his way all the way up. That dude knows where the missing bolt is.
Yeah.
Rickover was this way. He also demanded it of others. Don't be afraid to get down in the mud. Get down in the mud.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the mud is literal mud. Sometimes the mud is get down to the front lines of the consumer transaction. Stand there
Yes.
next to that guy while that thing breaks and his liability is ticking by
Yes.
the second. I remember Rickover applying this directly. They wanted to put a gasket on the reactor head instead of welding it shut. And they were looking for weight on the sub. And Rickover's like, how much weight are you going to save? And the guy's like, 700 pounds. And he said, really? You couldn't find 700 pounds elsewhere? He said, well, this is an easy place to get it. And Rickover snatched it and he goes, what if your son was in that compartment next to that reactor? Hold it. You want a piece of rubber in between there, or you want it welded shut? He really could put himself in the shoes of the sailor because he had done it and he had understood part of the grueling parts of the job. I still think about that guy working his way up from the factory floor. He's done every rung all the way up. Man, how much
Yep.
value is in that? That's incredible.
One of the phrases that we used at Precision Planting over the years was, if your boots aren't dirty, you're not doing your job. That's not just the where did you come from question, meaning have you spent time assembling the product? Have you spent time harvesting the crop or planting the crop? But it's meant to be ongoing. Are you continuing to spend time at the point of sale? Are you continuing to spend time at the point of support or at the point of product development? There's no role in the organization in which you can just rest on the laurels of your experience or rest on the metrics inside of the spreadsheet to give you direction or to give you insight into reality, because metrics are but a glance. Oftentimes leaders think that better decisions can be made absent from the emotion of the front line. And I think that there's a lens in which that can make some sense, but I don't think that a leader should ever be distant. You have to know the customer experience and continually be exposed to that customer experience, because otherwise it becomes academic. And I think a lot of bad decisions get made in pure academic environments. I'm not talking about colleges, but in just a pure numbers environment, rather than understanding the emotion and understanding the physical realities of that front line.
Growing up around the Navy, having a lot of relatives in the Navy's relatively clean. In a lot of ways, a very clean business. I type in some coordinates, I push a button, a missile takes off the deck, and, 300 people die somewhere. It's a lot different than like charging into somebody's hut with a bayonet. When you have to go in there and the effect of your decisions is right in front of your eyeballs, it changes things. If you're uncomfortable about what you're doing as it gets to the front lines, then it's more preferable to like sit back and play Sim City. You'd be like, oh, no. I've got my numbers here in my dashboard. All I do is click here. Having that sort of cultural connection between your frontline people, I think it starts with how you see them, how you treat them, and what you know about your decisions and how they affect them.
Now, I've seen a continuum. If we use the proximity to the end user or proximity to the customer, or proximity to the front lines, let's lay out a continuum. On one end, you have what I'll call the extreme perfectionist. This is the person that lets you know every minute, every hour that they did the job before. They go to bed at night believing that they can do the job better than you. They're critical. It's the back in my day guy, right? Every story starts with back in my day. In that end of the spectrum, you end up with an organization that is no bigger, no smarter, no faster than the leader. Because the only people that can survive in that organization are people who are willing to sit around and wait. Now, when the leader shows up, they're going to say, why aren't you going faster? Why aren't you doing this? Nobody ever works as hard as that. Well, they've all been trained to sit and wait because they don't want to go left when back in your day you went right. That boots dirty DNA, it can go too far. It can go to the point that it absolutely hinders an organization. The other extreme is a manager that I've always used the term the Dorito factory test. Now, Dorito factory testing has nothing to do with Lay's. I love Doritos, but there's these managers over my career that I would sit and I would listen to their department meetings, and they would talk about principles. They would talk about metrics. They would talk entirely in generalities: general customer, general production, general efficiencies, and there was no specifics to the business whatsoever. And so I started running this test early in my career. I'd finish a department meeting and I'd ask myself, what percentage of that meeting could have been recited word for word in front of the employees at the Dorito factory, and it would have had the exact same application. On one end, you have the manager that won't let anybody think beyond what they think. And then another manager on the other end that's completely devoid, just says, I could manage any business. You used a great term. Any business is a sim city. And so as a leader, there's a balancing act that is being struck. Not every leader has experience in every discipline that they lead. And so there are disciplines that you have more experience in, and you can coach and you can mentor and you can empower and you can enable, but not restrict. And then the other disciplines are the ones where we talked about earlier. That's where you hire and bring on people that bring that experience with them. And then you empower them and you entrust them. And so it's really interesting, this concept of the boots dirty. It's a powerful concept, but it can be taken too far, and you can actually start to limit and undercut all of the value of bringing on talented people. They'll ultimately just quit if you just tell talented people what to do day in and day out.
The old advertising guy, David Ogilvy, said, that's like buying the dog and doing all the barking yourself. That's like, what did you buy him for?
Right.
Rickover, he had to make hard cultural decisions. So the diesel submariners, that service had the highest death rate of any service in the Navy. Submariners. That was a crazy person's job. They were the most amazing mavericks, these diesel sub captains and their crews. They would sneak anywhere. They're torpedoing the snot out of people. They were amazing. These guys were cowboys. These guys were war fighters. These guys were great. And they had no business commanding a nuclear submarine. And they were so upset about that. Because here you come back from World War II. I mean, you are bold. You have innovated. You have built just amazing crews. And you've lost a lot of your brothers at sea. And now old Rickover is going to tell you you don't have what it takes to be in a nuclear submarine.
Right, because the strategy is completely different of operating a nuclear sub versus operating a diesel sub.
Yeah. I mean, it was such night and day. They were so upset with him because they were like, look, we've done this our whole service. It's just that culturally, diesel boat guys, nuclear boat guys, completely different people. Nuclear boat person, particularly missile boats, you know, you're going down and you're staying quiet. You're carrying enough fire. I mean, we don't have to go into the amount of firepower right now, but the amount of firepower that you're carrying with you, the fickleness of a nuclear reactor. I mean, you're basically containing a controlled explosion while you're under the water, you know, sealed inside of this thing. And so it takes a very different personality. You don't run fast and loose with a nuclear reactor.
Right.
So Rickover really did understand the future. He understood the ability to be submerged for a long time, very quietly, without having to snorkel to get fresh air to the engine, was a big idea. He understood that.
So one other one, Jeff, that you've mentioned, and this one I'm really interested to talk to. Rickover was somebody who led from the bridge. He led with his boots dirty. He knew technology. He was a precise guy. He was a detailed guy. He was a deep thinker. The way you phrase it is that subordinates want to follow someone worth following. Talk to me a little bit about what that means, someone worth following.
The shakedown cruise of a submarine, the first time they take a sub out, they're going to test it. They're going to take it down to depth. They're going to do emergency blow. They're going to do this. And look, this is a chance for stuff to break. Other than probably being engaged in real warfare, this is a chance to really put yourself at peril. And Rickover, even into his very old age, insisted on going on those shakedown cruises. He would go out for sea trials on the boats. Old man, you know, sitting in there. He wanted to be there.
Yep.
Something went wrong. He wanted it to happen to him. And I think that sets a good tone for the commanding officer, the officers, and the enlisted to look and say, hey, this guy's with us. You know, he's on our side. One of my favorite stories is Rickover. They're doing a sea trial on this particular submarine, and there was a leak in the escape trunk. Now, to repair this leak, protocol would say they would have to surface, and it was going to do this big delay, and they had an exercise coming. And so Rickover, I believe he goes and he changes into his coveralls, what a submariner calls his poopy suit. So he changes into his poopy suit, and he's got his work belt on with his hammer, and he says, I want the chief engineer to meet me here. And he was not a young man when this happened. They climb into the escape trunk, And he gets this young officer, and he tells him, he's like, look, I want you to stand here outside this door. And if we die in there, you get the honor of being the one to tell the captain. And so he shut the door and shut the engineer and Rickover into the escape trunk, and they're beating the crap out of the wall with this wooden block to stop the water from coming in, and they fixed it. This guy's a 4-star admiral, and here he is inside the ship, beating the wall with a wooden block. They got it. They got that he was with him, and look, he was always very upfront that he never wanted a sailor to be exposed to more radiation inside a submarine than he would be exposed to walking out on the street of a city in America. You know, he used to say this too. He used to say, "No two-headed babies." That was his thing. No two-headed babies, and they knew that. They knew that was important to him. And the monitoring systems on board submarines were super robust. You know, Rickover was a major proponent of the SubSafe program, which is a very expensive, long program to keep manufacturers from cutting corners, to make sure that the submarine is built correctly and that the sub is safe. Rickover was an out front champion on that. But it was also in his selection. And this is what Rickover is very known to be very notorious for. So Rickover was super specific about the kinds of people who could serve on nuclear submarines, the type of pressures that they could withstand, their decision making. So Rickover was known for his utterly insane interviews. And for all the listeners out there, I am endorsing these 0.0%. Rickover had sawed the first 2 inches off of his chair in front of his desk. So when you would sit down, you would become immediately uncomfortable. Like the chair would rock and you would start to fall out of it. And he did that on purpose so that you could not, whatever you'd rehearsed in your head or you were going to say or whatever, that all went out the window as you're trying to hold yourself in this chair. He also was known for doing things like he had and this happened multiple times. He had a door. He had a door in his office that went to a bathroom, but it also had another door that exited to like another corridor. So Rickover would tell someone that he had to go to the bathroom, and then he'd exit through the other door and he'd leave for the day. And he'd come back in the morning and see if they were still there. There was multiple people that were still there.
Oh my goodness.
There was this wonderful story where Rickover told a young applicant for the program, he said, you have 30 seconds to make me furious. And the guy's like, what? Yeah, you have 30 seconds to make me furious. The kid reaches down, takes his forearm, wipes all of Rickover's desk directly into the trash can. Rickover goes, you are successful. You're hired. Get out of my office. Rickover had these little small things about how he'd work that I thought was really interesting. He did not allow his people to delegate. If you gave a task to someone else, you still possess the responsibility. So they can do it. But if they screw up, it's on you. You're not allowed to be like, well, I gave that to Smithson over here and he wrecked it. No. The person delegated by Rickover owns the responsibility. It's on them, the quality of what comes out, whether they delegate or not. And I thought that was huge.
That's a similar concept in like the Jocko Willich extreme ownership, is that even in an instance where others on the team are doing an action, you maintain the responsibility that it is done complete.
It changes your mindset because now I'm on the hook for what this person does. And I like that because there's too many situations where it's like we just delegate things all the way down. And then the guy who had the least resources and the least ability to do it, we put him in front of the shooting or the firing line. And the people who had the resources and could open the doors, they just decided to push it off their desk.
To say it lightly, he could be hard to follow. Right? He was a person that, and we talked about how you want to have a person that's worth following. There were some traits and there were some personality aspects of Rickover that made him very easy to follow, but they were definitely contradicted by traits that made him difficult to follow. So Time magazine in 1954 writes of Rickover, he is sharp-tongued, spurred his men to exhaustion, ripped through red tape, drove contractors into rages. He went on making enemies, but by the end of the war, he had won the rank of captain. He also won a reputation as a man who gets things done. Articles that are written about him, it says that he was hyperactive, blunt, confrontational, insulting, and a workaholic, always demanding of others without regard for rank or position. Moreover, he had little tolerance for mediocrity and none for stupidity. Even while a captain, Rickover did not conceal his opinions, and many of the officers whom he regarded as unintelligent eventually rose to be admirals and were assigned to the Pentagon. In many ways, he's an inspirational leader in his vision. How does one contrast that with really, it was not pleasant to be in his presence?
No, no. And I had several friends that either my friends who worked for him or people that I interviewed for the book that worked for him loved him. Now, I had people who, like, I've
Okay.
got a friend who was an aide to another admiral in the Pentagon with Rickover, and this admiral would spar with Rickover, and Rickover could be very, very challenging. And there was lots of yelling, though yelling's not necessarily a new trait amongst that brass class, but there was lots of sparring back and forth. I look at it two different ways with this, and this is a hard thing, is that Rickover cost himself and the Navy some opportunities with his behavior. Probably one of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is Rickover's inability to find common ground with Elmo Zumwalt. Zumwalt once described Rickover as the third biggest threat to the Navy after the Russians and the Air Force. There was no love lost between the two guys, but that was a shame because Zumwalt was very much liked particularly by the rank and file. He had brought in some real compassion and grace to the enlisted sailors as they get their families moved around the country, stuff like that. And Zumwalt really understood these folks, and he was loved by them. And then on the other side, you've got Rickover, who desires to equip them and the country and the Navy with these superior abilities to make war. And the two men could have been so much more together. Zumwalt had been interviewed by Rickover for a post in the nuclear Navy. Rickover did his typical Rickover antics, and unlike many of the people who laughed it off, Zumwalt carried a chip on his shoulder against Rickover for a long time. And it was a shame.
So as you consider these leaders, because Rickover is not unique in this situation, right? You can read the biographies of Jobs, you can read the biographies of Musk, you can read the biographies of Patton. This is a kind of a well-known and well-described leadership style of intense people, very visionary, driven by a mission, and when people get in the way or are not equipping and enabling that mission, they turn into roadkill. Do you think that a leader like that only inspires the people that can just laugh that aspect off? Or can you actually be inspired if you're also frustrated by those behaviors?
I don't think they're required. I think that those behaviors are actually slowing down some progress. You and I've talked about it before, about leaders that are like for their moment. I don't know that anyone else could have done than Rickover, but I don't know that everything about what Rickover did was needed. It may have taken 80% of that break through the red tape personality. I think he had to be defensive. I think he had to be gruff in a lot of situations. But I think if he dialed it back 20%, we'd still have great submarines. We'd still have great people. And maybe there was an opportunity for collaborations that didn't exist. Okay, so tough guy, gruff guy, he was still open to being corrected. If you could make your case and lay it out logically, you could correct him. He would not get his feelings hurt and he wouldn't retaliate on you. That's a big one, man, because we've all told truth to power. Next thing you know, your desk is downstairs in the warehouse. You got to spray the bugs. That's what take care of the roach problem down here. Rickover was okay with you correcting him as long as you brought your A game.
It introduces an interesting question that I was wrestling with across the week here. Is that leadership style worth aspiring to?
Portions of it are.
You think about Musk, you think about Jobs, you think about Patton. Is the gruffness, is the coarseness, is the call it mission focused or lack of empathy, whatever you want to call it, is that a necessary component to that personality? Maybe Rickover couldn't dial it back 20%. Maybe if he dialed it back 20%, he wouldn't have had all the passion. And so it's interesting because so much is written about these guys. And when you read the people that knew them, there are some that, see the mission and kind of laugh off that guy got eviscerated and that guy's career was over, but it didn't happen to me, so I'm good with that. You kind of see that laugh off. But it's interesting as I think about, for hopeful leaders, do you aspire to that? Do you aim for that? Or is it just that's who they are from the moment they're born, and you're either in that category or you're not in that category?
I think it's portions of it, but I would say this: the organization is going to get the leaders that the organization wants. If we want a generation of
Sure.
yes men and yes women, that we start them off young and cultivate them up into the organization, and then they get to the top, and you really can't kind of excise that out until you've just got to do a massive chopping of the organization, because those things can
Right.
become insidious. There's far more organizations that get taken down by that than they get taken down by a Rickover.
Yes.
You just have bands and
Yeah.
bands and bands of complacency.
I've seen multiple scenarios, and I'm just observing across my career. I've seen multiple scenarios where I think people have improperly taken the tough as nails or the toughness aspect of a guy like Rickover and brought that into their leadership style, but have been completely absent of the inspiration side of a Rickover. And so you end up with a person that is both unlikable and uninspiring.
They're the Rickover bought on Temu, is what they are. What I see as being the big differentiator is people who are hard and challenging and dedicated and disciplined. The ones who are the toughest, the most disciplined, and the most demanding on themselves first, and then their
Nailed
people.
it.
They have
Nailed it.
that's the big differentiator, because you looked at Rickover. Yeah, he was a workaholic, and he studied and he learned, and he was toughest on himself. You read about Jobs, and you read about all the times, like how often Jobs would be crying in the meeting. This stuff hit him harder than it hit average people.
Yes.
And he may have had these really high demands, but his first demand was of himself. I think what you
Correct.
get is you get these people that try to be a battle axe, but they themselves are unfocused, undisciplined, unprepared. They only got there because
Correct.
they're a reliable bagman, but they're trying to emulate something they don't really understand at the core. Rickover was a
Yes.
fighter. There's no doubt about it that Rickover was a complete fighter. Rickover did not like Robert McNamara. During World War II, McNamara was an Air Force officer in the Office of Statistical Control. They had created this systems analysis approach to inventorying, measuring forces, stuff like that, to make predictions. There was parts of it that people entertained during World War II, not tremendously, but they did. McNamara comes out of there and he rises to the top of the Ford Motor Company. He comes in and he brings in
Yep.
this strategic analysis way of doing stuff. So they bring him over to be the Secretary of Defense, and he is now going to run the Defense Department with this strategic analysis. Rickover took him to task.
Yes.
He was like, your computers that you're so reliant upon are dependent on the quality of the data you're putting in, and the data you're putting in
Yes.
stinks.
Another story that I've heard of McNamara, the exact same point of data in causing poor summaries. I think it comes from the David Halberstam book, The Best and the Brightest, which is meant to describe the Kennedy cabinet during the Vietnam War. And McNamara, wanting pure information, he gave cards to every officer in the field in the Vietnam War, and they were supposed to fill out how much ammunition that they had used, how many resources they had used, and how many of the enemy they had removed from the field. Put yourself in the moment of a commanding officer who needs more resources, wants a promotion. How are you going to fill out every one of those cards, right? That you used fewer resources and that you were more effective than you would have otherwise been. And I think he says that in the sum total of all of those cards that were submitted over the term of the war, there were more enemy removed than the entire population of North Vietnam. If you just add up the data that
You
was
want to know how
submitted,
good we did? Just ask us.
comparing Rickover to McNamara. McNamara was the exact opposite in his leadership style, which was his boots weren't dirty. He wasn't leading from the bridge, didn't have the experience. It very much was a metrics is king. It can be run like a simulation. And the reality is that there's a lot of realities inside of the simulation that aren't represented. The metrics don't represent the exact transaction.
This was talked about in Vet TV's documentary, Let's Talk About the War. Command, or our CEO or whatever, has said, this is the version of the world I want to see. And people who tell me the version of the world I want to see will be rewarded. This is what happened in
Yes.
Afghanistan. The officers would pass, as each rank it went up, they'd either saddle it with their individual agenda or they would play down negative things. It would rise all the way up
Yes.
to commanders. The commanders were then acting on false information. They would then give their commands. It would go down, and their commands would then have new things piled on them to suit certain agendas and certain optics. It's like you're fighting a completely different war than the one that's actually existing.
A bureaucracy is not playing the game that is actually on the field. Once you establish a bureaucracy, you are competing against yourself. So little of your energy, creativity, and effort actually makes it onto the field once you get into a bureaucratic organization like that.
I've worked on a situation where I had two products side by side. One was outselling the other one 5, 6, 7 to 1. We were doing it for less money, all this stuff. They go to report the numbers on to like the top brass and the board and all that. They take the two products and they mix them together, the numbers. They're like, oh, yeah, in this segment, we did this. And it's like, hold on. What are you doing? And it was like, well, the product that wasn't doing so good, it had some political weight behind it. So everyone changed their reports to obscure it. So now the boss can't even make clear decisions on it. He's like, oh, yeah, well, that looks good. Let's fund that. And then it comes down and it's just this horrible loop.
My personal opinion is that it is the responsibility of leadership to know that that is the unaided natural state of an organization. If you are not rowing against that behavior as an organization, it is the whirlpool that every organization will end up in. That is the natural state of large organizations, is bureaucracy. And it is incumbent on the leader to know that and to break that down in verb, in action, in deed, and in word. My opinion is that organizations that end up there, there's no way the leader is not in the top 1 or 2 reasons that the organization ended up there.
Maybe that's why I'm an independent business or I work in a 2-person firm. Is just like, this stuff just makes me go crazy. It's like all these things, they build up out of nowhere and you have to manage them on top of managing the work at hand. It's not for the faint of heart, I'll tell you. So if people can do that artfully, they're worth their pay.
As we wrap here, what would be a few things you would say as you look at Admiral Rickover's life is worth noting and worth aspiring to?
Well, first thing I'd say is that it's okay to not match everybody else. There's going to be a lot of pressure in an organization to be a certain way, act a certain way, talk a certain way. But over time, the real you will show through. Be okay with being the real you. I mean, his entire career, he was different, but he leaned into that being different. Rickover never apologized for being Rickover. He knew who he was. Don't be afraid to get down in the bilges with the painted over bananas. There's some real joy in that work. I got a dealer I work for. One of his favorite things to do is come in on a Saturday and pressure wash manure spread. I was like, really? He said, yeah. He said, well, when they get a good dirty one come in. I said, why is that? He says, it's good for you. He said, so many things that I do in my job, they take weeks or even months to come to fruition. He says, but man, when you get a pressure washer and you clean a manure spreader, when you're done, you're really done. And he said, and I like that. That helps me mentally. The final thing is, though, and this is huge. Know what you're fighting for. Know what you're trying to achieve. Let's put this in Rickover's terms, okay? A single Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine can carry 24 Trident II missiles. The blast power of 5,800 Hiroshimas. Why would you build something like that? What on earth is that needed for? It is the principle of mutually assured destruction. The idea of this one was not to make war. Rickover would hope there was never a day we'd ever have a missile leave the tube on the submarine unless it was a test. The idea was peace.
Right.
in the time that he existed. Our enemies were ferocious, doing ferocious things around the world. They needed to know that if they went a certain way, there'd be no second chance for them. He wanted to build a world that could remain peaceful in the nuclear age. Few people knew what nuclear energy could do, quite like Rickover. He wanted to see it be peaceful. So if we had to ask, what is the cut of Rickover's jib? It was honesty, boldness, excellence, his antics, but more than anything else, it was the pursuit of peace for this country.
Well said. Well said, Jeff. I really appreciate all your research. I appreciate the time we get to spend talking about it. Thanks so much for joining me on Grody UnPrOfEsSiOnAL.
Thanks for having me, bud.
For anyone that would like to send comments, accolades, or gifts in kind, I can be reached via my email, justin@grody.io. If, after listening to this episode, you are still confused about why we did not discuss leaked NSA documents, it may be that you intended to listen to the podcast.
Grody и непрофессионально.
Thanks for your time. Let's do this again soon.